Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kishore Mahbubani. I'm the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. It gives me great pleasure to welcome this sellout crowd to this lecture by Rem Koolhaas. So I will just make, as some of you may know, 3 points. Now, the first point I'm going to make, because we've never organized a function together with the Singapore Institute of Architects, so we've never had this. This is a new audience for us, so it's a perfect audience for my first point, to make a commercial about the school and tell you why the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy is such a great school. I'm going to make 5 points about it. Firstly, that it is, of course, one of the fastest growing schools in the world. We started with less than 40 students in 2004. By the time the next academic year starts, we'll be up to 300 students. We started with 0 research centers in 2004. Now we have 5 research centers of excellence, like, for example, the Center on Asia and Globalization and the Asia Competitiveness Institute. Again, in 2004, we only had 1 partnership with the Kennedy School of Government. Now we are the first Asian School of Public Policy to join the Global Public Policy Network together with Columbia University, LSE, and Sion-Spo. And of course, we also, we are one of the most generous schools of public policy in the world. Our mission is to help improve governance in the world. And only 20% of our students come from Singapore, 80% come from overseas, and the ones that come from overseas come on scholarships funded by us. And this just, of course, brings me to my commercial, which is that in September this year, we're celebrating our 5th anniversary. If any of you are interested in making a donation to the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, this is the perfect time to do so. A second point, a quick note about the campus. I thought I should bring you, this is one, as you know, one of the most historical sites in Singapore. In fact, we just discovered that on 22nd July next month, we'll be celebrating the 80th anniversary of this site as a campus, and in fact we hope to have a function to celebrate that event too. This is one of the most beautiful and one of the most historic sites in Singapore, which in a sense makes it a perfect place for Rem Koolhaas to come and deliver the lecture that he's delivering. And finally, a note on the speaker. As you know, I mean, you all know this because you're already here. He's a world-renowned Dutch architect, an architectural theorist, urbanist, and professor in practice of Architecture and Urban Design at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University, USA. He studied at the Netherlands Film and Television Academy, at the Architectural Association School of Architecture in London, and at Cornell University. He's the co-founder and principal of the Office of Metropolitan Architecture, OMA, and of the research-oriented counterpart, AMO, which explains the title that we have today. He also co-founded the Volume magazine. Now, what I'm going to do now is just read 2 citations or descriptions of Rem Koolhaas. First was, of course, when he won the Pritzker Prize in the year 2000. In the citation, the Pritzker Prize jury described Mr. Koolhaas as a visionary and a philosopher and described his works as follows, quote, Rem Koolhaas's work is as much about ideas as it is buildings. He became famous for his writings and social commentary before any of his designs were constructed. And they say here, and some of his most celebrated designs are still only on the drawing board. And then, of course, in 2008, Time magazine put him as one of the 100 world's most influential people. And I'll just read one paragraph of what Time magazine said about him. They say that we tend to think of great architects as people who impose their vision on the world. They come bearing significant forms and whip cities into shape. Rem Koolhaas, they say, is different. The Dutch-born architect, polemicist, doesn't think architecture should change the world so much as the world should change architecture. In cities from Lagos to Lahore, he has looked at the messy facts on the ground to see how designers and planners can submit themselves most usefully to the realities all around them. He has led graduate seminars on the generic cities of the developing world, not to see how these places can be rationalized, but to learn from their irrationality. And by the way, today, I've only met Rem Koolhaas for the first time today. I discovered the most significant feature about his life, which is not mentioned in this official biography, which is that he shares something in common with President Barack Obama. He also spent 4 years of his childhood in Jakarta, Indonesia, and he also, like Barack Obama, speaks Bahasa Indonesia. So over to you, Rem.
I was prepared for a lecture that is a lecture for people who are not architects. And what I wanted to do is to talk about what architecture can do and indirectly, of course, what architecture cannot do. So it's kind of really a lecture about architecture and not about kind of buildings or other things an architect might talk about. Basically, I want to talk briefly about the situation of architecture today. Maybe this used to be architecture, and you all, whatever culture you have, you all understand what the point of this building is. It's a solid building, it celebrates something, it is not dedicated to insignificant things, and it expresses something. And that used to be architecture until a regime, an economic regime started maybe 20 years ago, the market economy, which more and more and over larger and larger parts of the world started to spread its ideology, because I feel it's very important to read it as an ideology, where the public sector withdrew and where the private sector took over. And somehow that shift, where of course money became more important than almost any other issue, and making money, that had a very drastic effect on architecture, because architecture suddenly became like this. So in a way you could describe the history of the last 20 years as the shift between this and this. And how would we describe this? Now architecture has to be iconic, it has to be slightly strange, it can no longer be kind of rectangular, and more and more I think it almost cannot have any content. The clients of most of this architecture are developers, kind of rather than the public sector, and so therefore the contents of this architecture on the whole has become quite limited. And this is a skyline that are generated by combining the major works of the major architects of the last 10 years in one single image, including our own, not out of immodesty, but out of a kind of self-criticism. Because if you see this kind of skyline of strangeness, you see that there is a very dangerous condition going on, namely that the buildings don't reinforce each other anymore, but that they seem to cancel each other out. And I think that is a sad state in architecture. The architect himself has become a media figure. In this image you see the kind of American architect Peter Eisenman being pursued by media in a monument that he created, which is dedicated to the memory of the Jews of Germany. So what we see here in the center, the gray-haired person pursued by this pack of newspaper paparazzi, who themselves obviously do not respect the purposes of his monument. And for me this is very emblematic of architecture today, working for media with this increasing disconnect between what you could do and how it is perceived. Now, what we try to do is kind of really not resist this tendency, because I think that architecture is an art which makes it very difficult to resist, because it costs so much money, because it is so crucial, because it involves so many people, because it is so visible. It's very difficult to use it for subversive purposes. But what we try to do is somehow make our architecture slightly different and actually think of architecture differently. First of all, it is a group work. We are not alone, but we work with a cluster of relationships that range from the BBC to McKinsey. And we work collectively with that cluster to generate intelligence. The second thing, which is the person of the technical person here, because the mouse doesn't work, and it would be really much nicer for you and for me if it did. Can the technical person come back and try to connect? Anyway, the second thing is that we are an office in Europe, and you see the cluster of stars, but we work all over the world. And that creates a kind of entirely new situation in architecture, namely that the architect works in situations of which he or she knows fundamentally little. In less and less cases, are you working in a context, you know where you have grown up, etc., where you have relationships. So you work almost always in alien situations, and that forces the office, our office, into a parallel activity to the building, which is an activity of research. This research is simply to try to understand the world in which we are working, sometimes before we are working in it. And of course, given the kind of tendency of the economy, that mostly means to try to understand Asia and developments in Asia. As part of our work, we keep a kind of permanent track. Can somebody, the technical person, can he come here and kind of try to fix the... What we try to do is to keep a permanent record of how the world evolves, from pensions to prisoners to youth and to freedom. Can you simply create the mouse? Yeah? Sorry for this interaction, but it will make... Thank you. Yes, thank you. So we keep this permanent record of the world, simply because it clarifies, both for our clients and for ourselves, what the context is in which we operate. For instance, if you look at the simple fact of youth, and you consider that red is the youngest kind of part of the world, then the red patch of the world, including the Arab world, Pakistan and Afghanistan, that simple fact explains more than kind of volumes of more political tracts can explain. And the same is true, of course, of growth, illiteracy, standards, and energy consumption. We are very aware that we are working in a non-homogeneous world in which there are different political systems, and more importantly, in which one political system, democracy, no longer can hope to convert the other part, except perhaps leading through example in certain cases. It's a world where the different political systems coexist and have to exist together, and have to find a modus together for this coexistence. So superimposed on that is, of course, a vast difference in growth factors, a shrinking Europe, you could say a shrinking democracy, and an incredible energy in China. And superimposed on that is, of course, therefore, the different distribution of wealth and of ownership. If you simply look at sovereign wealth funds, you see that the non-democratic red is dominant, that the half democracy is about half, and that the democracies themselves are becoming relatively poor. I think that that condition in itself needs to be addressed by architects, and architects have to find a way to work within those conditions. We have been trying to do that kind of simply through research, as I said, and part of that research is my activity in Harvard, which allows me any year to take a single subject and to try to understand it with my students. And what I want to kind of present here is simply a brief collection or anthology of those researches that perhaps most meaningfully started in '94 with a portrait of Singapore. Singapore was in '94 a deeply unpopular country, at least in the West, and I said it with irony. And you probably are aware of William Gibson's quote, "Disney with the death penalty." You know, that was in a way the best the West could do about Singapore, and I went there simply to try to understand better and understand more what the kind of real situation and what more than anything else, what the history of Singapore had been in the past 30 years. Singapore is interesting to a Dutchman because it is about the same scale as Holland, and in its planning has also kind of been influenced by Holland. It's very much a self-made country, and therefore it is based on the tabula rasa. And for me, it was extremely interesting to explore its history because it confronted me with the first time with the following fact, that modernization has always been the property of the West. We invented modernity, we developed it, and what has been happening, of course, in the last 20 years is that we no longer retain the initiative in modernizations, and that everywhere else modernizations are taking place outside the control of the West according to rules and ideas that are no longer the property of the West. And so that makes the standard critique of a place like Singapore so insipid and so useless, because the essence, of course, is to try to understand and take a place like Singapore seriously on its own terms, which is what we did. And we did it partly by discovering the seriousness of Singaporean architects like the person who's sitting here on the front row, to my great pleasure, and discovering that they themselves had worked in Singapore and kind of produced masterpieces of modern architecture that were entirely unknown in the West. So what the kind of exploration of Singapore kind of really taught me is that modernization is now taking place and owned by Asia much more than by the Western world, and that therefore it is very crucial to dedicate time and understand that new phase of modernization. The second step was kind of really looking at Singapore, at China, looking at the kind of space which was left in its current interpretation of communism, and looking at the consequences of on architecture and on the status of the city. One of the things we did in '95 was look at the amount of architects per 1,000 people. In Europe, we are very much blessed with architects. America, about half is blessed, and China has very few architects. Then we looked at honorariums. Then you see that kind of Europe is blessed with very high honorariums. America is about half, and China works with very low honorariums. And then we looked at the volume of building. Then you see that kind of Europeans built almost nothing. That Americans built a lot, and that the Chinese kind of built at least kind of 20 or 30 times the amount any European can ever hope to build in his lifetime. So at that time, in '95, we therefore declared the Chinese architect, by definition, the most important architect in the world. And we deliberately did that to kind of really make and try to shift the searchlight, which is so stubbornly on Western architecture, away from the West, and signal that if only in quantitative terms, but very soon also in qualitative terms, the Chinese architect deserves not only respect but also, more than anything, perhaps attention, and that also the kind of city which is emerging under this condition deserves to be analyzed. And it's a kind of very unique kind of city because this is Shenzhen. This is the center of Shenzhen, a kind of highly dense metropolitan intersection with skyscrapers. But less than 200 meters away from it, or maybe 300 meters, there are rice fields. And so there's never been a period in history, I think, where the city became so pervasive on the one hand, but also contained such stark contrast as in this case, and in the case in China everywhere. On the one hand, highly metropolitan, on the other hand, rural. And for the first time, and I think that this will be a feature of the 21st century, that these conditions, rather than be polarities, will become more and more merged. And in certain ways, you could also read sections of Singapore in the same way. The third and perhaps most extreme research we did was in Africa, where we were particularly interested in what happens if enormous amounts of people live together in desperately poor environments. And I took the city of Lagos as a kind of prototype of that condition. It's a city on the Atlantic Ocean. And at first sight, and this is important to say it first sight, at first sight it is a smoking, burning garbage dump almost. And so this aspect of garbage and chaos seemed almost unimaginably pervasive at first sight. Here you see another image in which after a while you discover that it's actually an inhabited a landscape where people live, people are housing, and actually it's a kind of situation where people work. So at first sight it looks like utter chaos, in which nothing is happening, but if you look really at the kind of pattern that is emerging, you see that emerging from that chaos, there are also more ordered kind of moments and more structured moments. And then you discover that the entire city in itself, and perhaps Africa as a whole, is almost a systematic kind of recycling production, where almost everything is reused many times. And in that sense, almost a model of a kind of sustainable environment. And what you also discover is that this apparent chaos is not, and this apparent self-organization is actually taking place in kind of larger kind of infrastructural networks that have been imposed and kind of constructed by architectural hands. So what has been for me the incredibly interesting and suggestive aspect of Lagos is the interaction between improvisation on the one hand and the imposition of architecture that creates a kind of enabling infrastructure in which, in spite of the desperate poverty, thousands of people, and literally in the case of Lagos, literally millions of people can find and establish their daily life. The last and most recent, and now I shift to another kind of area of the researches, has been the Arab world, where we have been very active in the last 3-4 years, Dubai, Abu Dhabi. A kind of strange amalgamation of, on the one hand, the West, and on the other hand, the East. On the one hand, this contrast is very harsh. On the other hand, it is perhaps important to say that it's an Islamic country, and that this degree of tolerance of these kind of mutual coexistences is perhaps an achievement and not only a caricature. But just like Singapore in the 90s, it is again an urban environment and a culture that is relentlessly pursued with criticism and followed with criticism from the senior Western critics. In this case, Mike Davis, whose salient statement about Dubai is like Walt Disney meets Albert Speer, the architect of the Nazis, on the shores of Araby. And I think it's very significant that two Americans twice used the word Disney to denigrate first Singapore and then Dubai. Almost as if Disney is the fatwa that is used to, in a way, keep a distance from phenomena that actually deserve more serious attention. And so that also happened when we looked and dug at the kind of history of Dubai, and it turned out that, again, we were confronted here with a piece of authentic modernization that started in the 70s. Again, modernization that took place away from the European umbrella, so to speak, and which was led to a large extent by the rulers themselves. So again, not democratic the way the European typically expects it, but nevertheless a very significant and in certain cases careful process of modernization that actually has created in what was desert one of the most modern conditions and plausible conditions in the Middle East, certainly, and partly in Asia. And so therefore, and now I switch to architecture, it is very important for us and very interesting for us to actually work in this situation as architects. And I will show one project that we're doing in Doha, which is the capital of Qatar, for the Sheikha, who also was the client of the Islamic Museum by Pei that recently opened on a campus where there is a number of important architects can invited, where we are doing the library. We have been, from the very beginning, extremely interested in doing libraries because we think the library is a wonderful combination of different intentions. It's a place where people meet, but also a place where people learn. So it's a place where you need to be alone, but also a place where you need to be collective. It's a device which is necessary in any culture. And so therefore it's not simply an imposition, but it is a type, of course, also with perhaps the longest history of typologies in architecture, at least 3,000 years. So it's both eternal and constantly fresh. This library in Qatar, we interpret it as a kind of single plate, a square. You see the floor plan here. Which we folded at different corners, and we folded it and then we terraced it. And the kind of reason we did that is that the problem of libraries and the problem of books is that a library always has a kind of enormous amount of books, but if you're in the library, it is very difficult to get an overview. You never know quite where the books are, leave alone what books are there. And by simply terracing the entire collection of books, if you're in the center of the library, you have a kind of immediate overview of the books. And actually, like this image of a library in the 18th century, the walls of the library are actually defined by the books. In the same way, here in Qatar, the simple folding of the plate and the terraces of books on those plates create a kind of wonderful accessibility, almost in a single glance, of the entire stock of the library, so that you are never lost and can always find your different section. And then we kind of topped it with a kind of similar shape and used in a very rational way every gesture, so that where the plate is lifted off the ground, we create an entrance in the center of the library. Perhaps the most ambitious library that we have built is a library in Seattle, where we not only built a library but also looked briefly at the whole history of the library and see that libraries were initially intended for books, but over the 20th century they accumulated more and more different media, So that currently a library is also about cinema. You also have DVDs. You have records. It's about sound, music, photography. So it becomes essentially a media center. If you look at the library and as its function, you see it's not only for reading, but there's also children's collection, information, there's adult education, there are disadvantaged things, so it becomes a more and more social, it expands its social mission. And of course a library is a very complex entity today because it is something which is very traditional and it is about books. But also media have to play a very important role. So it is about stability and evolution at the same time in a single building. So, and this is, I think, perhaps the most pure way example of how we work. We looked at the program, here represented by a bar, and then analyzed and shifted to the left every part of the program that we thought would remain stable over time. I.e. parking is not likely to change, the books are not likely to change in terms of their materiality, work is not likely to change a lot. So all of the elements to the left are stable, but kids change a lot and their expectations change. The living room, as the kind of most public part of the building was called, which receives the public, also has to change because the public changes. Reading changes because it's not only books, it will also be the computer. So the library became a kind of combination of robust and highly organized entities that we expected to remain relatively identical over time, and spaces in between that were much freer and that could evolve at their own nature. So the entire building became almost a barcode where stability and change alternate in different forms. And that diagram became then also the building. You see the kind of solid elements. So you see the solid elements, and then you see where the highly organized elements of the library are, and then you see the kind of spaces in between, which can be much more improvised, open, and free, and then the whole thing is clad in a kind of single skin. That is also the structure. Here, can you hear me? Is it working now? Here you see the library in its kind of reality, and you still see this alternation in the image: solid, open, solid, and open. So the alternative, the diagram of the organization, becomes also the appearance of the building, and also, in my view, kind of an element of its beauty, with an alternation of open spaces like this one, where the entire community of the city of Seattle can get together in a kind of improvised way, whether they want to read books or not, or where they can kind of read in casual kind of environments, or kind of very dense and intense kind of computerized zones in between for the real specialist and the real interested person. So in that sense, I think it's an exemplary building in that its organization and the way in which it addresses the contemporary moment is also translated in an aesthetic that is compelling. We try to do the same thing in all our buildings to a greater or lesser extent, and perhaps in the interest of time, I shift. And perhaps in no building kind of more directly than the building we're building in China, in Beijing. In 2001, we were invited to 2 competitions. One was for the reconstruction of the World Trade Centers, destroyed in 9/11, and the other one was for the headquarters of Central China Television. And we were confronted with a dilemma because we could not do the 2 competitions at the same time. But we made an almost political judgment at the time that kind of somehow the reconstruction of 9/11 did at that point would not enable a kind of really forward-looking architecture to emerge, and that it was crucial to be able to play the role in the modernization of China. And so therefore we went for the CCTV building and came up with a building that you see here, a shape. And for us an interesting shape because it is not a needle, not a skyscraper, but a single loop, a building that starts horizontally on the ground, that then has a vertical element, turns horizontal again, and has a second vertical element that ties together so that everything is organized in a single loop. And that loop stands in the heart of Beijing. And what it tries to do is to define the big building in a different way, not simply as a needle that consumes place in the city, but actually as another more complex shape that generates a space in the city, and that also kind of symbolizes a certain openness. Now, and this is the kind of dilemma that I really want to share. Participating in the CCTV competition was used very much against us. And this is a typical quote. The buildings of evil, Petersburg, Beijing, Dubai, the stars of the international architecture, work with enthusiasm for tyrants and autocrats. And so I think that we live in a very interesting moment where Europe is somehow sticking with its own interpretation of the world and kind of resisting openness to other environments, and where those, like our office, who is trying to explore the possibilities and also the potentials of other environments, and try to also explore how we can align ourselves with this other and newer form of modernization, are mistrusted and criticized very seriously. So our participation in the adventure of China, and you see here Ole Scheer, my partner in Beijing, and myself at the groundbreaking ceremony, was seen as a kind of betrayal, even though we see it as something kind of entirely different, namely an investigation what we can do with the situation in China. But of course we are very much aware of the situation in China and the difficult aspects of it. And so therefore we ourselves, of course, have raised the bar very highly in terms of what we contribute, or ask ourselves, what are we contributing to China then? What is our pretension? What is our claim? And I think there is a number of them. It's not only a form or a shape that is more or less interesting. It's not only an icon that we are putting there in Beijing, but it's actually a very complex organization that organizes the TV making in China in Sokol on the ground floor, a complex of studios, a tower for broadcasting, a tower for script writing, and a kind of section for management. But perhaps more importantly than all of these, or equally important, a single trajectory or path with which the Chinese public for the first time can enter the domain of the media. So here you see this kind of red path that actually connects through all the floors and all the elements and somehow gives a glimpse to the Chinese public of the media production. So that is one effect that we believe we are adding. The second element is not necessarily something that we give to China, but where we somehow are trying to see what the best of the European effort and the best of the Chinese effort can yield in new possibilities. In this case, on the level of technology and particularly on the level of structure. Structural engineering is a very stubbornly conservative field. The laws of gravity are irrevocable. You cannot tamper with them. You cannot suspend them. So they dictate everything. And therefore, this conservatism kind of basically dictates shape. In this case, we try to not so much resist it, but work with it. This is the unfolded skin of the building, where we looked and where we looked at the stresses that the shape induces on a diagonal grid. And instead of reinforcing the grid at the areas of greatest stress, we simply doubled it. And when there is no great stress, we eliminated the grid. So out of this comes a kind of structure or design that looks highly irregular and even decorative, but it is actually a diagram of the field of forces. And so we are convinced that it was crucial, it was really an invention on our part, but that no one but the Chinese could ever have built it. And in that sense, it really represents a genuine collaboration and a genuine kind of experiment with this phase of modernization, where only in this site, this degree of freedom for structure and this degree of experimentation with structure could be exercised and realized. Here you see the building in its current condition in the city of China, city of Beijing. And what we also think, and maybe that is our third and something that we can only prove in retrospect, that the language of the building, including its irregularity and its pattern and its slopes, is very compatible with the Chinese environment around it, even the kind of low-scale informal hovels of the hutongs, so that it's not a kind of modern architecture that crushes the environment or is completely alien, but that there is a more fundamental connection. I now want to move to the third part of the lecture. I've shown you the research section. I've shown you a number of architectural projects that embody research and that could never have happened in their environments without an earlier exploration of the political and economic conditions in those environments. I now show a kind of further evolution of the work in terms of a realization perhaps 10 years ago that these are almost a kind of random catalog of our clients, very diverse, corporations in different countries, education, commercial, etc., but that if we put all our clients in this column, and if we then look at subjects, media, business, culture, and politics, that we could extract from all of these experience kind of learning and knowledge about media, business, culture, and politics. So more and more, we are not looking at our clients as some people we service, but also we look at them as domains and experiences from which we can learn and where we can extract knowledge that we can then consolidate in different forms. We also realized that a number of words like architect, blueprint, platform, framework, facade, structure, model are used not only in a literal sense in architecture, but are increasingly used in metaphorical sense. You know, a blueprint of a plan, a framework for an agreement, a structure underpinning a relationships, a facade to a phenomenon. And that therefore, since we were the expert of these words, we did not necessarily have to limit our activity in architecture itself, in building, but that we could also apply it to different domains. And so we started a second organization. Our first office is called Office for Metropolitan Architecture, OMA. We started AMO to try to see whether we could apply sheer architectural thinking to different issues, almost acting like consultants, to completely different issues than building itself. I will show you a number of examples. One was the magazine Wired. Wired flourished and coincided with the internet bubble. As you know, at some point the internet bubble burst, and Wired came to us and said, kind of, how can we somehow revive Wired, or what can we do after the internet bubble? And so we looked at Wired and kind of looked at their demographics of their readers and kind of discovered that very predictably it was mostly comprised of computer nerds, therefore young male people between 25 or let's say 20 and maybe 45 at the most. And so that there were vast kind of territories of the demographic spectrum that were not even remotely covered by them. So that then became a clear discovery, and I would say almost an architectural discovery, but then explore the remaining territory and try to see what Wired can do to cover it. So we proposed special issues for women, special issues about politics, issues connected to the UN, issues of criticism, and issues of art. And so basically, if you've kind of read Wired in the past couple of years, you see that indeed they kind of shifted away from this kind of pure involvement with technology and kind of widened their kind of readership in that way, and that the current readership of Wired is actually kind of much more extensive patch than it was in the beginning. And so for us, this is almost like a kind of form of planning where you explore a territory and where in an almost architectural or urbanistic way, you look what you can do with the territory. A very similar effort we then made for all the magazines of this group, Condé Nast, who own, I think, 24 or 30 magazines worldwide. And there we looked at how you could potentially, if these are all the magazines in one direction and in the other direction, by intersecting the magazines, how you could spawn or generate new magazines. For instance, Vogue is dedicated to fashion. They have a magazine on golf. So you could create a new magazine on fashion for golf. In the same way, we intersected all kinds of magazines. And so basically, in the past 5 years, they've also kind of created new magazines according to 3 of our intersections. And there again, I would say that that is almost similar to planning, where kind of rather than carving architectural terrain, you work in the terrain of media in a similar way. Perhaps the most ambitious and also risky work that AMO has been doing so far is work about Europe. So far, in a way, everything I've shown and spoken about is not European or is outside Europe. And as you can understand, and as is in other ways probably very clear, I am a European, and painfully aware on the one hand of the way in which the initiative is no longer in European hands, but also happy with that situation because it gives so much new territory to explore and so many new collaborations to conceive. But at the same time, of course, I remain European and interested in Europe. And particularly through these external experiences, very alarmed at what I see as part of the stagnation of Europe and also the naivety of Europe. I'm a passionate defender of the case of the EU, the United European Union, but I'm completely desperate how naively and iconographically stupid it is represented. This is the headquarters of Europe, and we see a terrible sculpture and a kind of nameplate in too many languages. If you compare the physical environment of the American system or the Chinese system with the physical environment of the European system, a series of rental offices that Europe doesn't even own, anonymous, hidden in a kind of city of Brussels, you see that there is a kind of vast problem. If you see the kind of ceremonies we organize, they have nothing of the almost militaristic position of other ideological systems. If you see our events, they're embarrassingly clumsy and almost uncontrollable in their, almost absurd in their quantities. Yet, what Europe achieved over the past 25 years is actually incredible, or 50 years is actually incredible, because as you probably know, but maybe not really know, until the year 45 of the last century, Europe was kind of one series of warring factions and countries that tried to kill and destroy each other. And it is kind of really this kind of problem is the problem of Europe, that kind of in spite of this incredible achievement, you know, to go from here to here, it still hasn't found either a language to convey it or the institutions to expand it. And this is perhaps one of the sharpest way of putting our problem. It happens to be from your dean, but there is now a considerable literature that kind of reinforces this point of view. So it's actually, on the one hand, humiliating. It's great to be part of that achievement as a European, but also humiliating to be in this position. And no wonder we are highly confused, and we don't even know whether we like Europe anymore ourselves. And so there is not only a beginning of contempt on the outside, but the kind of situation in Europe internally is being eroded by our own hesitations and ambiguities. So one thing that we have been kind of asked by the Europeans is it not possible to represent Europe in a kind of more interesting and modern way, and in a way in which people could identify? Because this Europe, the blue Europe, has become a fearful image, because what people and Europeans worry about is that somehow they lose their identity. And this is perhaps the great problem of European politicians. They have not been able to present Europe as something in addition, a space where every European gets, in addition to his nationality, a space for maneuver, a space for expression. No, on the contrary, the politicians themselves have contributed to a feeling where people are fearful and feel that this Europe diminishes their identity. So one way in which we could represent Europe is simply insist not on homogeneity, but on difference. And one form that we kind of propose to use for the European Union is to develop a European barcode where simply every single country of Europe is represented, and where the more countries become part of Europe, the more extensive this barcode will be. And so our argument is, Europe is not singular. We all contribute to a larger whole. Nothing is taken away, and the resulting situation is actually rich and not poor. And so in certain cases, we work with kind of morose people trying to create enthusiasm for Europe and to represent Europe in a different way. Because in terms of GDP, Europe is amazing and is exceeding, and that is the giant kind of part. But if you would, for instance, look at Olympics and look again at European models versus Chinese or American models, Europe is also, and this comes as a total surprise to the European self-image, Europe is even athletic. Europe could, instead of being kind of highly neurotic about letting people access and share, could actually be welcoming, friendly and open. And therefore, one of the key things that we think is that we should not only represent Europe in a different way, but we should also try to see where Europe actually could be not exemplary, but create a reality on the ground of genuine achievement of which it could be proud again. This is and we think that kind of energy is perhaps a very promising field for that renewal of self-respect and enthusiasm for the larger whole of Europe. We have an incredible investment in wind already, vastly bigger than America and China. But there again, you see that America and China are both beginning to take over and investing much more in energy there. So we took the initiative, but then we are now losing it. And we are currently working on a kind of blueprint for Europe, for a kind of sustainable energy plan for Europe that will be exemplary in connecting the entire of Europe, the whole of Europe, in a kind of single system which explores and exploits, in every case, the unique conditions of Europe. In the north, and in the North Sea particularly, of course, there is an enormous amount of wind. In the south, there's an enormous amount of sun. In the east, there is a lot of sun. So what we're currently working for with the EU is a kind of single combined European energy network which exploits in the North Sea the incredible winds, which can be coupled to any of the kind of countries, and which uses the infrastructure of the kind of oil platforms that are now no longer necessary, and the kind of pipelines to distribute not oil but energy and cables. So it's a kind of very interesting combination of new technology that uses the infrastructure of the old technology so that it doesn't have to invest everything new, and where we are discovering that the total potential of the North Sea in fact is larger than the entire Middle East in terms of oil. And so this is a project that has not been launched, but which kind of very soon will be a massive European announcement, where through this reality of a kind of European performance, we don't have to moralize, we don't have to tell other people what to do, but we show by example how this extremely complex issue can be dealt with in a genuine way. And for us as architects, it's of course a very exciting dimension that simply by shifting to architecture not as physical entities but as a kind of form of thinking, we are able to contribute to something like this. And this could be the advertising, 71, 2000, 2100, and where we are again developing then the language to make that work. This was a very important moment for us when the European Union actually adopted our logo for a visit by Bush, the American president. We felt that it was very rare for an architect to enter the political sphere this literally. And it was a kind of beginning of thinking about Europe's position in this world. I've kind of suggested to you how we see it as architects and what we think the relationship between the world and the European could be, and how extensive the communication could be. If you see on a political level that is not yet happening, Europe is very ambiguous because it's never clear who is the leader of Europe. Is it Sarkozy or is it Barroso? We always point fingers. And we are not alert enough on all the other associations and connections that are emerging almost on a weekly basis as we are absent from this discourse. I think that Europe is really part of Asia. It's kind of a very obvious point. It's a kind of single landmass. And for us, it has been very exciting to interpret it as a single landmass and to experience the consequences of that single landmass as a single field of operation and as a single field where you can develop your intelligence and display your intelligence. So what we are now on a more political level trying to introduce in Europe itself is an encouragement for recognizing this condition as not as in a hierarchical situation, as a kind of situation that needs help, but as a kind of territory of equals, very, very different cultures, all with their own gifts, tradition, prominence, and quantities, all kind of rather than imposing rules and laws involved in a kind of network of communication and where all these terms like human rights, corruption, freedom of speech, free trade all need to be readjusted and renegotiated probably in a kind of endless round of communication in which the architect can play a certain modest but relatively active role. Thank you.
I must say you covered an enormous amount of ground. You left us completely breathless. We were supposed to finish at 7, but I think we'll stay on another 10 minutes or so for questions. And I'll ask the first question, which I think is on the minds of many Asians here. As you know, in the 21st century, all the mega cities are going to be produced in Asia. Huge, huge cities on a scale that we've never seen before. As you envisage those mega cities coming, do you feel optimistic or pessimistic?
Basically, I'm a pessimist out of as a decision.
I sort of.
Because I think that it's the only kind of position you can, which enables you to proceed and to be active. But
why
I think that there are a number of points where you could be optimistic, and I think that I'm particularly interesting to see evolve a new condition of the city of which I really spoke, because I think that as cities get bigger and bigger, it's no longer the kind of contained city that is concentrated on a single place. It becomes more and more extensive. And so it will be a totally different kind of city that also includes its own opposition. It will be cities that will have kind of large territories of park or large territories of nature or large territories that are completely different. So it will no longer be a kind of city that is homogeneous and recognizable like the city in Paris, but it will, by definition, be more like an anthology of different conditions rather than a single monotonous condition.
Okay, 2 or 3 questions. Who's got the first one? Are you all equally breathless? Yeah, I see a hand up there. Please come to the mic.
Okay, I'll try. You mentioned one thing is that you need a stable government to have the city planning so that the buildings can be merged with the rest, and also so that you can build buildings like CC Tower. Because without a stable long-term government, such things may not be able to be accomplished.
It is very true that architecture needs a very long time. And it is also true that, of course, the more ambitious the architecture is, the longer it takes typically. And that there is in environments where there's a constant kind of political kind of cycle, some kind of architecture is becoming difficult. But on the other hand, in those countries, let's take Europe, where there's a very constant kind of renewal or alternation of governments. There's, of course, a civil service that maintains clarity and stability, and there's also there the private sector, which can more than it used to take over very ambitious projects. So it's a constant shifting, constantly shifting situation. But I don't think that the kind of ambitious architecture we stand for inevitably need authoritarian regimes for them to be realized. It's not that simple.
Next question.
And I would say that, for instance, that a building like CCTV, I sincerely believe that it was only possible when it happened, and I'm not sure that, for instance, if the competition was held today, we would win it, if only for the fact that at the time foreign architects were possibly more sophisticated than Chinese architects, but there has been an incredible acceleration of Chinese sophistication, so I would say that now it's much more equal, and therefore the outcome could have easily been a Chinese winner.
Have you met this? Okay, have you met this Chinese architect who's got this? I think website is www.imad.med.
Uh-huh.
Have you met him? He's another example of a Chinese architect. Okay.
First and foremost, thank you for a lovely talk. But very direct question regarding CCTV tower. You showed a slide with the hutongs in the foreground, and you said it doesn't stand apart from them. I was a bit lost as to what you felt as the relationship with the hutongs.
It's of course very different. It's very different in scale, but for me it's not incompatible. Today you have to contrast between a new thing and an old thing, where the new thing absolutely destroys the old thing. Even if it doesn't literally do it, the two are utterly incompatible. I think that here, in terms of aesthetics and language and mood, there is a resonance between the two. That's what I mean. But that's, of course, a totally private example and a private conviction.
Please.
I should say also that my initial Paul, who was an architect and I was not an architect, was intended to simply check for me whether my initial assumption that you were all amateurs was true or not. What I had done is prepare a lecture for amateurs about what architecture can do. So it's not that I was particularly ambitious or megalomaniac in terms of kind of showing the range. I just wanted to create an inventory of different kinds of interventions that are possible today.
By the way, we've never had so many architects in the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy.
Hi, I'm Patrick, and I'm not an architect, so you don't have to worry about that. A recurring thread throughout your talk is this one side, individuation, right? And then wrapping that up into the possibilities or being aggregated into some kind of society or ecology, right? Now, how feasible is that, though, going forward? We know that we have to build up in certain spaces where it's certainly constrained, right? How do we provide for flexibility and individuality, right, inside of a need for aggregation and consolidation?
I'm not sure I totally understand your question, but I would say that kind of, for instance, the Seattle Library shows a very wide range of different forms of accommodation in a single building, from the most private and isolated to the most collectivist and symbolic, from the most pragmatic and utilitarian to the more symbolic and almost additional. So
I guess to put more of a...
I think his question is about how do you try to preserve individual identity as you get getting taller and taller into denser spaces to accommodate more people. How do you preserve individual identity?
Well, I think in that library, for me, there is a number of interiors and kind of privacies in that larger entity, moods in that larger entity, and genuinely different environments that are one of the ways in which you can try to do that. I would say also in CCTV, I think it's not a permanent presence of everyone, in a single large mass, but again, a series of crafted fragments that try to, for each need, create a very appropriate environment.
Yeah, I guess part of the point is that technology is giving us a lot of control in our lives, right? And right now we can sit down with basic tools from Google and begin to design things, right? At some point, this is probably going to catch on, and you're going to be able to design more and more things in your life, beyond just your room, right, or how you do certain things, right? And being able to express more of your individuality, right, may be a thing that needs to be taken care of, or at least provide for, perhaps. Right.
Well, I think that basically whatever we do doesn't take away individuality or kind of scope of creativity in individual people's life.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, like in the beginning,
I think I've got to stop the conversation with you. Okay, the next question over there, and then after that, this may be the second last question.
Right,
the last question over there, and then we're going to stop, please.
Thank you for the interesting lecture, Mr. Koolhaas. I'm an architect, so a Singaporean architect. So from the context of Singapore, I'm interested to find out, since 1993, you wrote the songlines of Singapore, about 16 years ago. Then you talk about Singapore as a shopping city in your further publications. So from your visit from then till now, how would you, if you're given a chance to rewrite that songlines for Singapore? And then as a city, what we are known as a model city in Asia, how do you see the role of Singapore? How will we emerge or change in this current context in the whole region of ASEAN? Thank you.
I think it's a very important question, but at this point I really cannot answer it because I haven't been involved at all in the recent 5 years. And for that reason, I don't want to answer it. Although I can see kind of many shifts, of course, in terms of the kind of relative importance of surrounding countries that certainly will have a kind of big impact on it. I think what I expect and what I can see is that there is perhaps lesser discipline and more discussion of what creativity needs and brings. And I think that is kind of probably the next level of development that is taking place at this current moment. But I don't know kind of really what form it currently takes.
That's because he spent the day in the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy.
Yeah.
Over to you. Last question. Sorry.
Professor, sorry, I'm an architect also. I'm John. I'm very, very impressed with the way you re-envision Europe, not as a blue solid mass, but as a mosaic. Okay? And so there's one slide that caught my eye also, beside the two slides of Europe, is Shenzhen. If I can read you correctly, I think in a way you are sort of criticizing the way Shenzhen is developing. So just imagine that today you are the collective political mind of China. How would you now go and envision the city makings of the cities that will come up on the coastal western coast of China? Thank you.
That's one kind of thing I literally cannot imagine.
You cannot imagine being the collective mind of China? By the way, the CCTV is the collective mind of China, and you're building correct garrison.
It intersected with it. But I think that the point is kind of, I would like to simply kind of relativize the word criticism. None of this is a criticism. It's kind of really a study of a given situation. And I think also to answer your question, kind of, are you optimistic or not? I think what I didn't express very well, I think that it's not only that cities are getting bigger, but the whole notion of city is changing. And from something that you can actually control and compose, it's become something that is much more like a process, and therefore partly beyond our control, but in this lack of control also becoming much richer, because there are more and more things are coexisting in it. And so for me, the naivety of this image where a rice field is less than 300 meters from the major intersection is also a form of a model that could be deeply exciting, of combining things that you've never seen in a single image,
Well, I think you will all agree that we've had a fascinating time with REM. I have now come to the conclusion that we made a big mistake in looking for professors in the field of public policy only from economists, political scientists, international lawyers. I think from now on we're going to recruit architects to teach in the School of Public Policy because you have the widest range. Thank you.